Bless you.
Glad you got that out before the recording.
Yeah, for real.
All right, we should be good to go whenever you guys are.
Is it being recorded? Because I wasn't asked for anything.
Yeah, it's recording.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
So I hope I'm going to do a great job, but I would like to start with a little bit of some of the thoughts that I had on metaphysics. So I have to say that I was introduced to metaphysics by David. I didn't have any previous experience with metaphysics, a little bit with philosophy. I read a little bit when I was a teenager in high school. So we met over some weekends and we talked about it, and it was quite of an experience for me, spiritual as well, because I remember when we talked about different worldviews in the past meetings, and I was talking with David and just diving deep into metaphysics, logics, or philosophy. One thing that stood out to me is that it's very easy for a lot of people to make decisions about the most important things in their lives at an early age with very little experience and with very superficial thinking, which is obviously very detrimental, because when we're talking about metaphysics, we talk about the existence itself, whether things are or aren't. And as I spoke with David, he said, I remember, which is really interesting, the real question is not whether there's a God or there isn't a God. The real question is whether there is existence or there isn't. So it's exactly what Shakespeare said, to be or not to be. And that's the thing we have to first judge, discern, and then from that on, we can go on and move and try to prove the existence of God and see whether it coheres with the Bible or any other worldview. So in so many ways, metaphysics came as, let's say, reinforcement of my faith and a confirmation of a lot of the things that I believe, like most of the things that I believe. And it just made me think that my biblical view and my faith in God, according to the Bible, it's a necessary way of thinking. It's so necessary that to me, there's no other way of thinking reality other than that. So for me as a Christian, it was a great confirmation of these things. And as I'm going to start today talking about the core, the essence of metaphysics, which is the act of being, the ontological fundament of reality. And ontology, you said that you talked about it last time, it's a sub-branch of philosophy that deals with things that are, with the existence of things and what are the causes, the reasoning behind existence itself. So the terminology is a little bit complicated, and for David, it's almost like breathing. For me, it's asthma right now, because the philosophical language is quite stiff. But once you understand it, you get the hang of it. You can really construct the argument very easily. So in reality, things are, but they are part of something greater than themselves. So we're all partaking to something complete, like the universe. And that is the notion of participation, which is that there are two types of participation. And what David wrote is, to participate means to take part in something, or to have in a limited way something that in itself has to be found in a total, a complete and absolute way. And we have in metaphysics, it's from the Aristotelian philosophy that is continued in the church tradition. I think Thomistic Thomas Aquinas especially uses this dichotomy of actuality and potentiality. In actuality, or the actualization of something, has to do with the act of being. And the act of being is a pure act. Like God is a pure act of being. And if you don't understand some of the things, try to think about this presentation as being something very simple and easy to understand, because that at least works for me when I'm confronted with something very complicated. If I'm telling myself it's actually simple, then things are going to complete each other once I go deeper and deeper. And you have also the potentiality as the opposite of actualization, and also the notion of essence that we're going to explain a little bit later on. David explained very well to me the difference between the act of being and essence. So to put it in an example, essence is me being human, which is like a larger category of things, like humans are a category, but the act of being, the actual manifestation of my essence is my own individual. So Ruxandra is my actual being. I think I'm correct. David, interrupt me if I'm not. So to talk about participation, which is how we actually operate in the space, in the universe, we talk about predicamental participation and transcendental participation. The predicamental participation, I managed to understand because I associated with the predicament or predicate in Latin, which has to do with the verb, the action, actually performing something in a sentence. And it has to do with the essence, and the essence is that which participates, so the general category, which is also the secondary substance. We also have the notion of primary and secondary substance. And as a primary substance, we talk about specific things. For instance, we have Fido, the dog. It was a famous dog. Fido, the name of the dog, is the primary substance, which is the individual dog. The secondary substance is the larger category, the genus of dogs. And so that is a part of participation that is strictly related to our, let's say, day-to-day existence. And then we have transcendental participation, which has to do with the act of being, with God himself sometimes, and refers to that which is or has participated already. And the participant is the actual essence or the secondary substance. Just coughing. It's really early. Now we move on to the predicamental participation and try to deepen the concept. And what participates is to be found in all substances in a univocal way. And these terms, I think we can explain them later because it's very important to have the distinction between equivocal and univocal, equivalent or identity. And there's no, as I mentioned before, in terms of substance, there's no substantial difference between individuals of the same species, but an accidental one. And when we talk about accidents, we talk about the actual things that make an individual an individual. And accident has to do with contingency. For instance, from the broader category of humans as a, let's say, a secondary substance, I myself as a primary substance differentiate myself by accidents for the fact that I'm Romanian, I have brown eyes, I have dark blonde hair, and things like that that characterizes us as individuals, like even physical differences. Now, to dissect the question a little bit more, there's a triple composition of the entity in relation to the potentiality, actuality dichotomy. We have substance and accident. As I repeated, John and Mark are substantially equal. Now I'm repeating some of the things I just said because I hope it's going to make sense. But they differentiate themselves by the same reasons I differentiate myself from other people, which I just mentioned before. People have the same value ontologically speaking when we talk about essence in the act of being. We all have equal value because we partake into the same genera, like the genus Proximus in zoology. And then we talk about matter and form, which it's a little bit different in Christian theology or Christian philosophy compared to Aristotle. He talked about matter and form is that which contains matter. I think it's the recipient of matter. And in this context, the human essence, which is the secondary substance, does not exist outside of the concrete real individual. So it's intrinsically connected to the individuals. It is in the potency of being in which it is abstracted and universalized. And in case you have a question about potency and actuality, the potency I always associated with physics. You know, we have potential and kinetic energy. Kinetic energy is what actually is happening, but potential energies is always the possibility of something happening. So every object or being has a potential of doing something, of participating in a certain manner, and that is potency. So I think I'm going to simplify this because this is a rather complicated slide for me, but just to say again what I said before, in a way, trying to repeat it to myself, trying to also to re-explain it to myself, because these are concepts that are still quite foreign for me. When we talk about substance, we have the first and the secondary substance. The first substance, which is the individual, that is differentiated by accidents from its genus, is a subject to the change of accidents. As I said, accidents are individual characteristics. We have the notion of subsistence that is related to the subject, that is related to the subject being itself, and it cannot be in another. So I cannot duplicate myself, I cannot manifest myself outside of myself. So it's just related to my own being within my form, my matter, my soul. The first substance is related to the gender or the genus of things, and is a result, or it is due to the essence of things. And that is a subcategory of the secondary substance, which is treated in a logical sense, which is an abstraction. When we talk about the logical, when we talk about the word logical, we talk about abstraction. So I exist as a person, but my logical me is my abstraction, the way you understand me in your mind, with your thoughts. So the thought of me is actually me in a logical sense. I think that's how we best put it.
Ruxandra, I would like to
Yeah,
add
please.
the clarification that God is not a substance, because it's not a subject of changes, of accident changes. So it's pure existence, it's hypostasis, so to speak. That is the Greek word, because we were using the Latin in the slide, which is subsistere, but in the Greek conception is hypostasis. So in this case, God is pure substance, so a pure subsistence. I don't know how to pronounce that.
Subsistence, yeah, subsistence.
Okay, subsistence. Yeah, in that way.
I don't know. I think it's the English term hypostasis. Hypostasis. I think that's the English word, or how you pronounce the Greek. I'm not very sure, but I know this is common in Romania. We have hypostasis. So yeah, that is a very important thing. What David said, that God is pure being. He's not substance, because if you talk about substance, you talk about something that is subjected to accidents or change in time, and God doesn't change. God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, as the Bible says. And yeah, this comes to complete the next slide. It's just like a reinforcement of that what David said, because accidents, the only subsistent substance. So therefore, we cannot talk about accidents in regards to God. They make extrinsic changes that are tangible, that we can see in reality, that have to do with matter. However, substance remains with its essence, however, with external changes. So, as I said before, substance is Peter, accident is eye color or hair color or size or whatever. And they're subject to contingency accidents themselves. So, yeah, it's interesting when talking about the essence. A lot of these things are self-explanatory. So a lot of the things that we're talking about, as I understand, they just simply are. It's sometimes not all of them, but sometimes it's absurd to even think about the necessity of a demonstration for their being, because they're so obvious. And when we talk about essence, we refer to the form or the soul. Like Aristotle referred to the form, in Christianity we refer to the soul, and the soul is that which animates us, is the immaterial part of our being. And we talk about quiddidad, which is a Latin that means actually, I think it's whatness, that which is, quiddidad. It's like a term that is invented by necessity. So it's more than just the thing, it's that which is. It's the whatness of things. Essence is related to nature, which determines the operations that we perform in the universe, or our actions. And it's also universal. When we talk about secondary substance, the universality of trees as a general category. And then you have the primary substance of an oak tree. So when we talk about the essence, is that for which and in which the concrete entity participates in the act of being, so how it actually exists. And it orders the actual being to be in a particular way, so it can manifest itself in very specific ways. And it also limits the actual being to its specific gender. So the actual being is limited by who we actually are. We cannot do things that somebody else can do who's different than us in some ways. Now, I think I might need David's help in this slide because I don't know if I have
Yes.
yeah. I
Well,
don't think I can explain coherently.
Well, this is basically one aspect of the definition of the essence, which is the form. The form. This is the nature conceptions of the essence. Now, this what I wrote there was that it's a subject's principles of operations. It inclines him or a person to act immanently in a particular way. For example, if I am a human, I'm determined only to operate in this matter. But notice here that there is passive potencies or faculties, and the faculties are potency of the soul. And it is passive potency because it is there without actualization. It's like the nature. For example, a baby, or it's not a baby, but when it's within the mother, I don't know the English noun, but it's like a baby within
The cradle.
Sorry?
The cradle?
I don't know, but it's before being born.
Okay, so it's like the fetus, the embryo.
The fetus, or the embryo, okay? It has the nature of humanity. It's a human being because it has the passive potency in his soul, in his form, like rationality. But that is why it's principle of operations and it's in potency. Then, when we talk about active potency, it's the actualization of passive potencies that they produce and operations. They are the actualization of the passive potency, like thinking, like using mathematical operations, doing speaking, feeling, having emotional trauma, so to speak. So this is the actualization of what is in their soul, in their form, that is called passive potency. And this is according to the degrees of life. So the form is also called soul. And there are three different souls here: the spiritual soul, the vegetative soul, and the sensitive soul. So here we're talking about like the plants, trees. Then we can talk about the animals, like dogs, cats, and then we can talk about human beings. If it says angels as well. But for we have here in philosophy, we can say, for example, that God is eternal because the Bible said that. But we are not using the scripture. We are using just philosophy here. So it is important to make this clear, these limits. So here we can talk about the spirituality of the soul of human beings. Now, why? Because in the first soul, we only have nutrition, growth, and development. So here, I think that I'm going to explain that in the, or Ruxandra maybe is going to explain the difference between matter and form, because the form is immersed in the matter and the vegetative soul. That is to say that the matter, because the matter is pure potency, limited the operation of the soul or the form. It cannot subsist if the matter is destroyed, like a tree, for example. Now, in the sensitive soul, something similar happens, but there is a higher degree of life in this soul, because it at least have movement, self-movement, so to speak, by sensitive appetite, sensitive knowledge, locomotion, like animals. But the spiritual soul, like we have will, rational appetite, we have intellectual knowledge. So in these cases, our soul can survive after the destruction of our body because the soul still have operations that doesn't require the body. In some cases, or by contrast, there are operations that depends on the body, like abstractions, because there is nothing in the intellect that was not before in the sense, in our sense. So, for example, I can see you, Ruxandra, as a singular and concrete entity, and then I can abstract your ghost, so to speak, and have your intelligible image by my eyes, by my sight, and then my intellect, my agent intellect, take this image from you and abstract the essence, the second substance, and then it's universalized, and it is sent then to my possible intellect, and my possible intellect receive this image, this secondary substance, and comprehend your nature, comprehend this, the form, this, and then you have to make a conversions to the singular entity, which is Ruxandra, to comprehend how how she's thinking, because she's able to think, but what is she thinking right now as a singular entity.
I hope I
So,
am.
yeah. So in these cases, the soul requires the body, but there are another operation that doesn't require the body, like intentionality, or self introspections, and so far. So it doesn't require the sensitive aspect of the body. So it at least can survive after the separation of the body when the person died. But it succeeds imperfectly because it still requires the body to make another or perform another operations. So, and this is a mystery in philosophy. What happened with us after the separation, we don't know, but we can only know that we can subsist, at least from realism, from this school. Okay. Okay, this is the form. This is the nature conception of the form of the essence.
I don't know if you want me to move down to the act of being.
Yes.
Yeah, I really wanted to say the fact that what you just said before is just it's several phases of understanding reality, which confirms to me, because I treated these things also from my, let's say, scientific view, and everything that I've been through with David is in so many ways confirmed by science, or by, let's say, speculative science like quantum physics, things that we don't yet understand, but we have an intuition of how they actually work. And I really like the fact that you can extrapolate from here the necessity of accepting the fact that we have a soul with an intellectual capacity and mind that is outside the body, because exactly how David said, you know, he can take an abstraction of me with his senses, so he can perceive me with the sight, with his hearing, and he can then interiorize the image of me into his mind, so the information goes to the brain, but the brain doesn't really, the brain gets just impulses like electrical energy, basically. So the brain is kind of useless. It's just energy if there's nothing behind it that animates it. So it's necessary to assume that there is a mind that is beyond the brain, that I can afterwards process this information in an intellectual and a spiritual way and understand, okay, this is Ruxandra as an individual, and this is my nature, my essence. So it's also in medicine just recently, because the deeper you go into medical scholarship, the more you realize that you know very little. For instance, you cannot explain pain. You know, pain is just an electrical impulse. Like an electrical impulse goes through the neurons. Neurons are just matter. But what is it that we can feel pain with? What is that we can feel happiness with? Because electrical impulses are just nothing. They don't generate something that complex. So I think it's also like an interesting thing to correlate to what we were just saying, because it applies this into practice. Yeah, I probably talked a little bit too much on the parenthesis, but if you want to jump in, David, on the act of being, because the act of being is a very important part, and as you said, God is pure. It's a pure act. He has no substance, and when we talk about the act of being, we're talking about this transfer, which is a mystery from not being to being. Whether there's the potentiality of something or someone's existence before they're even conceived. So I thought about the abstract question: is there the potentiality of my existence even before I was conceived? And I think on this logical argumentation, we can follow up to the idea of the necessity of the existence of God.
Ruxandra,
yeah.
I noticed an error in the presentation. It said, for example, Peter can communicate his form. Like
it's a negative.
I cannot
yeah.
communicate his being of Peter, or like being Ruxandra or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the actual being, as David organized the slide, it is given by the being to the form of the substance. So God, if we talk about it in Christian terms, gives us the form and the substance so we can come into being. And the act of being is different from the essence. We can conceive the essence of the Minotaur, for instance, but it does not exist. So the reality imposes the necessity of differentiating the act of being from the essence, because something has to act in order to exist, to manifest its existence, so we can detect it as something that exists. The act of being is something that causes the existence of the substance. As I said, if you're talking Christian terms, God. And it also makes the substance singular in not able to, I don't know if that's the word, incommunicable, but yeah, as David said, like Peter is Peter. Peter cannot replicate himself. He can only contribute by procreation. For instance, Peter can procreate children, but he cannot make other Peters. He makes other human individuals. So he makes other individuals part of the, let's say, secondary substance of humans, maybe his ethnicity, but they're going to be different individuals. So entities cannot give being, they cannot reproduce being, they can only participate in this act of being. So there's this thing beyond entities that is necessary to assume from the very beginning. And then I think this is when it gets a little bit more complex. We talk about the transcendental participation. We're talking about the act of being. The act of being does not belong to the essence, because the two are different in reality, as I said before, as David mentioned the example of the Minotaur. So the essence of the Minotaur doesn't exist because it has no act of being. It's not manifested. And entities participate in the act of being in different ways because their entities themselves are limited and they're individual and they're subjected to accidents. So they manifest themselves according to their contingency. And there's a gradual participation according to the act. And here we have to differentiate, as David said, between matter and form. Matter is the potency, and we talk about a stone. A stone is pure potency, as we have the example, because it's completely immersed in matter. So stone is not made of anything else but matter. And if it's not made of matter, then it doesn't exist anymore. It cannot operate. It doesn't have any capacity of self-movement. When we talk about self-movement, we talk about will. So the stone just exists. It doesn't do anything else than just be there. And we also have matter. We can talk about substances that are composite and immaterial. And composite substances in reality are, by composite, I mean that they're made of both matter and an immaterial substance, which is the soul, like human beings. Human beings are composite matters because they both have the bodies and the souls. However, I think, David, if I'm not mistaken, you cannot talk about God as a composite matter. He is pure. I think some of the theologians said that God is pure substance, but you actually deny the fact that God is substance, because substance is also subject to accident, right?
Yeah, and even the angel, if the angel were, well, if they exist, they are not composed by matter and form, but they still have this potency there. It's not matter, but it's potency. That's why we describe a relation between these triple compositions in the terms of potency and act, even if there is a substance in accidents, matter and form. But the point is that there is in angel, if they exist, it's composition between potency and act, but not matter, only form. And God is not a substance, so there is no potency there. So there is no God is simple in that way, or the being is simple. I'm not using the term God as the Christian God, and I'm using the term of God as the being that is drawn from philosophy.
Yeah, I don't know if it's correct, but you use God as a philosophical category, just as a notion, as a concept, as a general concept.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So I don't know when I should stop, maybe around this slide, because sometimes I feel like I'm surprised myself at the text, but then it makes sense because sometimes we restate things in a little bit slightly different form to make it a little bit more tangible. So we talked about the essence. The essence behaves as potentiality in regard to the act that actualizes it once it takes part in the act of being. So no form is considered in action until it receives the property of being. Therefore, it is metaphysically caused. This is a necessary, logical, not even assumption. It's a logical deduction, a conclusion. It's more of a deduction that things, once they start their existence and they act, they participate into the universe, they move, they have the capacity of self-movement, they have to be metaphysically caused, because we talked previously that we cannot replicate entities, we can just participate in the act, like for instance, reproduction. And I think this is a little bit too much now, but I remember this in the communist Romania, we had this thing repeated over and over again in school, that matter is eternal and non-created, which is a nonsense, but they had to state that that matter itself is eternal and it's not created, because there isn't any God, and it's not even necessary to even think about God, because matter has always existed, but matter is subject to so much change and entropy, so it's a contradiction. And when we talk about entity, we talk about what actually is, or the essence. And is, as a verb, is the act of being itself as a concept, as the philosophical category we talked about. The act of being is infinite, absolute, and simple. I think simple is the opposite of composite, right, David? Not complex.
Yeah, without composition between matter and form, it's like that.
So it's not about complexity, it's about the opposite of being composite, as I talked, the composite substances made of matter and form, and it's only related to the things in our universe, like tangible things, us. So we also talk about simple to complex in terms of entities, so us, not God himself. The infinite act is found in a way in the participant himself, in the participant in the act of being, but it's limited by the participant's potency. So the potency is everything that we are capable of doing. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're actually doing, but our capacities or intrinsic capacities. So for this reason, being is said to be analogical to all these realities, and we talk about various essences. And I think I'm going to ask David to...
Right there for a second.
Yeah.
You go back up a slide.
This one?
Yeah, before we go on, I just wanted to, if we had some questions to clarify some stuff before moving on to more stuff.
Yeah, so I missed the last time, so I have just some like vocabulary questions, kind of like I don't know what matter and form are. Like what, like when you say matter, I think of the physics stuff. Is that the same?
Oh no, I think that we in a couple of slides we are going to explain the matter, and the form, and we can go deeper there.
Yeah, but just like really basic, like in like 5 words, what is matter, like in the philosophical sense?
Okay, there are 2 different matter. It's the primary matter and the secondary matter. The first is basically known by metaphysical analysis. And that is to say, there is something that is Ruxandra, you have the vocabulary, so you can explain that.
Yeah, I got the
It's
little.
in the slide. It's in another slide.
Is it like in the next slides? Oh yeah.
Yeah, here in the next one. Here.
Yeah.
Is what something is made of and remain within it. Matter is X, Y, and Y. It's what something is made of and remains within it. So, for example, you never will see the primary matter without a form, because it's pure potentiality. You can consider, for example, wood. Wood is a material. It's something. It's primary matter, but you will never see without a form. You can imagine wood in a guitar or in a, how do you say that? In a seat, or something like that. But you will never see matter without the form.
Okay, and
So,
what is form then?
Form is, so matter is contained in the form, right, David? Form is that which contains matter in Aristotelian sense.
It's the essence. It's the essence.
The essence.
It's the first determination. But I'm going to explain that in the next, in the formal cause in the next slide. But it's not. It's not necessarily the figure. It's not necessarily the figure. Sorry.
Is form and essence interchangeable for our purposes, or?
Yeah, if the form is okay in that way, it's not the figure. Or a figurative things.
So it'd be like this specific pen is the matter, but then like pens in general would be the form.
Okay,
yeah,
so
like the being of like
form is the category of box.
In the case of the pens, it had different materials, and I would say that is secondary matter. It's part of something that is already is, because the pens was created or made by another physical materials. So that would be a secondary matter.
And you thought, if when you talk about primary matter in a very concrete example, can you talk about primary matter as being trees or wood, and then secondary matter is a pencil, because that's the kind of a byproduct of the primary matter somehow.
Yeah, but you can still develop the idea, Ruxandra, until we get this slide. Maybe we can explain that better.
I think I'm gonna give you, gonna let you talk soon, David, if you have nothing against it, because I'll take a break, because I think I'm talking very loud. I'm not sure how loud it is.
Okay. Now we need to
but there
move
was slide 10, I think.
Here.
Yeah, this
Yes.
one. It was the transcendental
Esa.
participation.
Correcto, esa es.
Because that's important.
Well, metaphysically speaking, creation is the transcendental participation of being that God gives to the creature. So, and the essence does not pre-exist in regard to the act, and it is created within the composition of the entity itself. So when the composition is there, like matter and form, essence and out of being, then we can talk about the essence existing within the concrete singular entity, but not before the out of being. And the entity cannot ontologically establish itself. So it requires an ontological fundament or foundation. And the out of being is an act of a certain determinate potency that limits it by entry into the composition of the essence. So we have two conceptions of participation here, the static one and the dynamic. And in the first, participation is compositions of actuality and potency. And then we have participations that happens by causality. This is dynamic. And what is in actuality is due to the essence. Okay, the essence is the cause of the ordination of the act. Because the essence does not exist out of the concrete singular thing. So the concrete is that have the out of being, but is ordered by the essence. We can move, and then we can study the causes, the intrinsic causes like material causes and formal causes, And then we can study the efficient cause and the final cause as an extrinsic one. And in all of them pointing out the two aspects of reality, the predicamental and the transcendental reality. And for predicamental, we will have the causes fieri. And then in the other one, transcendental, we will have the causes essendi. Essendi comes from esse being. So, okay, and nothing passes from potentiality or for potency to actuality unless through the metaphysical movement of an agent that is already in actions or actuality. So that's why if somebody said that the universe is eternal, it is still cost in its being, because it's not the fullness of the being. It still have composition of potency, and it still requires a cost. And then we are going to see that, because from potency to actually to act, we need a metaphysical movement there, and the metaphysical movement is performed by an efficient cause. Then we can move there. Now, this is the question that somebody asked. Matter is what something is made of and remains within it. Matter is void and qual. Now, here material cause have the primary matter and the secondary matter. And the first, before being something, matter has no actuality. It is the first subject of substantial changes. So the forms determine what that it is. For example, the forms like a human being determine human being, determine the matter. This is the first substantial determination in the matter. So the matter is pure potency in regard of the act of being, and the act of being is received in the form or in the essence. It is known only from metaphysical analysis. And the secondary matter is more common because it's part of something that already is. It is the subject that is already in actuality and can be transformed. Even here, we can talk about we can talk about babies, the procreation, the transmission of life. We can talk about artificial fabrications or manufacturing, and it is only known by physical analysis. Is what the example that the pencil, for example. Now, it is the causes, in both cases, the material cause is the cause for substance having matter. We can move to the next one because there are a couple of them. And the formal cause is that for which something is what it is. The form is the quiritas and the essence of an object. So we have the substantial form that is made matter to exist and receive the being, and this is the first substantial determination of the matter. And then we have the accidental form that made it to be in a particular way, like the color, the size, and so on. And all of them are determinations. And that's why the essence is limitations, represent limitations, because it determines a particular way of being. Is a proportion of the being, is the measure of the being. Now, it is because the substance has a form, that is the reason that the substance has a form is because this, if the substantial form changes, the primary matter remains. For example, would remain if the first form or the substantial forms changes. If you corrupt for example, the seed and transform it in another object, the primary matter subsists, but the substantial form changes. And then we have the spiritual forms that depends on the act of being and not on a matter, because the forms is receive the being, so it doesn't require the matter to exist. That is why it's possible to think in a spiritual source subsisting out of the body. It is logically possible to think in angels, and the pure act of being is spiritual in that way. It doesn't require the matter. So subsists without the matter and therefore is immortal. And the matter is pure potency and participate doubly, participate as form in the form and participate as the act of being which is received in the form. Oh, please. Then we have the metaphysical causations. Well, here we study the intrinsic causes for the causes theory. Now I'm going to explain theory cause. Please, next one. Now the secondary cause, which is theory causes, orders of the causes that act. So moving and transforming, the acts moving and transforming by itself. For example, we have the transmission of life, the artificial fabrications. Now, this is the point or the meaning of theory cause. Entities that are the cause of making other entities. So, for example, two persons can bring a baby, so we cause it, we make other entities. Now, we lead the being through the form, and the essence is communicated according to its own form. I produce babies according to my human being, so they are going to be human. But we don't give the being, because the only one I have is mine. It's my proper being. I am David, and I can communicate that. So I only can communicate the essence, and we lead the being through our essence, through our form. Okay, that's one. And the efficient cause. Now, this is a key point, because the ontological causality or the transcendental causality or the ascending cause depends on this concept, the efficient cause. And every effect is metaphysically a posteriori to the efficient cause. We study the effect, and then we can have a conclusion of the cause. We can have knowledge of the cause. Now, the way of acting follows the way of being, operario et seguitur esse. And every agent performs something similar to himself, and the agent acts by virtue of the form of the nature. So there is a similarity within the effect, or with the effect and the cause. So here the point is that the efficient cause can link two things. That is why it's causality. Now, here we describe, and I'm going to explain very briefly, the type of efficient causes. The builder of a house, for example, which is causes the ultimate perfection of the things, the person who makes the materials for the house, the person who helps for the cause, and the person who makes the plans and technical building possible. So all of these participate as efficient causes. The next one, please, because it's too late. And the final causes, well, it is the queen of all causes, the regina causarum. Every agent necessarily works towards an end. So if every agent performs something similar to himself or to his own form, well, here we notice that every agent necessarily works toward an end. So it requires intellect. Okay, and the first of causes is the final. Now, I have a couple of notes here. Let me check that. Okay, the end is the one that sets in motion the whole mechanism of human activity. I say that it sets in motions because the end, being known and decided by the intellect and the will, is sufficient reasons for the will, which is the power of the soul, to order itself to achieve it. So there is a goodness within every entity, and there is not a moral goodness. I'm talking about ontological goodness, because the ends, I mean, the goodness has a sense of ends and a reason of ends. Now, there is a graduation of participations according to the act. So, and I noticed that by matter and form, a matter that doesn't obtain form if it is not metaphysically moved by the agent. This is actualizations, nothing passes by itself from potency to act, and the agent doesn't carry out the movement unless for the intention of an end, finis operantis. Now, here in the soul, oh, I'm not in the soul, in the, yes, in the soul, we have two tendencies, the sensitive appetitive and the intellectual appetitive, which is very known in philosophy as the voluntas sub natura and the voluntas sub ratio. Next one, please. The voluntas sub natura, in the next slide, please. Please. We have these conceptions by entities that tends toward an end by being moved by others, like natural inclinations, for example, nutrition, growth, and reproductions, and instrumentally coordinated. For example, an archer's arrow. But there are another way that in which entity can move, and that is by themselves. There is free will. That is the voluntas ut ratio, because there is you cannot desire something if before the goodness is not presented to the intellect. So, and then you can accept or reject the natural moral order. That is why it is free will in that cases. And we have this self-movement. Okay. Well, in metaphysics, the final causality consists of the goodness of things. Okay, the good has a meaning and reason for the end. There is a movement of the appetite towards that end, that good, which is called desire. So there is and by the way, there is a subordination of the goods, of the goodness. For example, we have the ultimate good, or goodness, the intermediary, or I don't know how to pronounce that, and proximate. The first, for example, is happiness, because it is decided by itself. We don't use happiness to another higher cost. Then we have, for example, the intermediary, that we decided for a goodness that is in another cost, in a higher cost. For example, taking medicine, but it's a bad medicine. We don't like that. However, we take that in virtue of another high cost, which is health or be restored. And then we have proximate end, which is decided for two things, for two aspects, by the goodness of that cause and by the goodness of another cause. For example, sport, doing sports. I like, for example, sport, so I enjoy doing sport, but also I like, or I do sport by having, by feeling good with my health or something like that. So there is a subordination of ends, of goodness. Now, metaphysical causation, well, we have seen 4 of them. And now we are going to consider the cause ascending or the ascending cause. Now, this is required by the operation of causality in the predicamental order. And the second causes do not reach to give being. They have it by participation, and it is their own, only their own. So only he who is being can give it. The fullness of the being is the being. So metaphysics is the primacy of being over thoughts, which is the oppositions or the opposite to, for example, René Descartes. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore exists. So it's opposite to that. Because things are, we can understand them. So the primacy of being over the thoughts. We can also put in context by Baruch Spinoza. Only God is substance, the rest is accidents. So for example, you and I are accidents. We are accidents of God. So as accident, we don't have an act of being by ourselves. We subsist in the substance, because the accidents, for example, the color white doesn't exist by itself. It exists in a subject, in a substance. So the only reality is, at the end of the day, is God, is the substance. In the God of Spinoza. Okay, Deus sive natura. This is like a pantheism. Pantheism, everything is God. And against David Hume, because he said that the facts are given by chance and there is only successions, no causality. Now, but this couldn't be explained by David Hume, so he failed in his philosophical development. So he failed in that way. But in these cases, the ascending cause is in opposition of these philosophical postulations or theses. Now, the concepts are obtained by abstractions of the essence of a singular entity. The being is not limited by the essence, it is unlimited, and it is not an entity. So God is not an entity, so he doesn't exist. We cannot have a concept of being because it doesn't have an essence, a limitation, an ordination of its being. However, the entity includes a proportion of being due to the essence or to its essence. Remember that I mentioned that the essence is the measure of the being. It's a proportion of the being. It's a limited proportion of the being. So if the entity includes a proportion of being. So by reason of efficient causality, there is a link between two elements by virtue of the fact that every agent works something similar to its form. There is a formal resemblance or similarity or likeness. Since the entity have a common foundations, the being, there is an analog community. So the essence of being cannot be conceptualized because it doesn't have one. The finite being cannot understand the actual of being. And by proper proportional analogy, which is the methods that I'm going to explain, it can be understood that what exists in the creature or in the entities immanently precedes in the being. So it's not about extrapolating a finite perfections located in the entity. Rather, it's recognizing that something that is in the effect is also in the cause. Okay, the methods. The proper proportional analogy plus ascending causality can allow us to give a discourse on being, or like if Ruxandra wants, a divine name, or transcendental attributes. Okay, but ascending causality by alone, it cannot give you much information that there is only a being. And by proper proportional analogy, it can give anything because we don't have the essence to contrast. We don't have the essence of the being to contrast that. So, but both together can allow us to predicate, to make predicamentation of this being. Now, and the value, the true value of that proposition would be understood in the later slides. Now, there is, wait.
Sorry.
There is an analog community. They have the being as the foundation. It is hoping to represent another entity because every entity has a different essence, but the analog is something that can represent perfectly that things, that entity, but it can also represent imperfectly another concept or another entity. Okay. All essence appear as a measure of being, and you can unify the whole from a similarity of proportions because every entity has a proportion of the being by its own essence. So every entity has a proportion there. So we can unify them as a similarity of proportion in regard with the being. But it is not a univocal predication. For example, as having 2, 4 is to 3 to 6, an analogy in the double, which is, for example, in the 8 and 16, that is univocal analogy, and we are not going to defend that because the difference is not eliminated. The third analogy is representative. To a concept, it can represent adequately, and to another, it can do it, but imperfectly. The next page. So we are ending. Well, every agent performs something similar to its form. The being is an agent that is not contained in any gender. So it's an equivocal cause. The equivocal cause produces an effect which is different from the cause. But there is still something there. There is something there. For example, the effect, the entities, reaches more remotely the similarity of the agent's form due to this equivocal cause. And the effect doesn't participate in the same species or gender reason as the agent. Rather, it participates by analogy. So there is something there in the effect that is also in the cause. Okay. But it can represent appropriately the entity, but it can represent perfectly the being, so to speak, which participate. Okay, so we have the being and the entity. So, but there is still a disproportion, or the disproportion remain unknown because we don't know the being exactly. We don't have the essence, so we don't know the right disproportion. It's different, for example, if I can compare life in a plant or in a tree with a human, because I can predicate and I can comprehend life of the tree. And it can also represent imperfectly the life of the human person. This is the life is the analog. But we know a human being, we know a tree, but we don't know the being. So by analogy itself, it can represent both. So that is why this method is not sufficient unless we complete that with the efficient cost, that every agent produces something similar. So there is a proportional similarity there. And let me check that. So I would like to say that, okay, even when we don't have a concept of the being, it doesn't follow that the concept of entity does not include a proportion of the being. Because every entity has essence and a lot of being, the proportional similarity is founded in these perfections that have with the being. So what I mean is that the similarity is not established from the content meaning by the form or essence. Rather, it is in virtue of the structure with the being. It is a comparison of proportion between the essence and the art of being. That is why the essence is the measure of the being and everything has one, but nothing exhausts the fullness of the being. In this case, the proportion allows us to know other entity because it has a proportional similarity with the being. And I can predicate something of the pure art of being as long as I find a known perfection, which is an analog, could be in a proposition as a substantial attribute of the being. For example, God is good. This proposition is true, but not because I know the content of the essence of God. Rather, I know it is true because I comprehend that the goodness I discovered in the entity pre-exists immanently in God. The content of transcendental attribute have an analogical similarity with the thing I know, and I can represent imperfectly what is in God, and because I understand by the ontological causality that the effect has a proportional likeness with his efficient but equivocal cause. Now, by saying that, I can explain the transcendental attributes. Now, the first things that the intellect knows is the entities, something that Avicenna said in his metaphysical book. The other conceptions are obtained by adding something to it, to the entity. It's additionally it ends. The added is not a different nature of a different nature than the entity, because the nature is entities in that cases. But to express an aspect of the same entity, for example, the special mode, various way of being by genders, predicamentations, substance, and accidents. So we add an accident or a substance, we can have a special wave of the entity. And on the other hand, we have the general mode, which is the separation. I mean, for example, in consideration of every entity in itself. So, for example, a thing, res, has an arrow being, ends, and is undivided, unum, because I can divide, for example, myself to have two Davids. So we are, I don't know, what is the word, Ruxandra, indivisible?
Was not able to be deduced? You mean it from undeductible? No.
Yeah,
I don't know right now.
Well,
but the opposite of deducing, yeah.
Then we have the general mode in consideration with the entity and the soul. For example, the soul, the two potency, the will and the intellect. And with the appetitive, for example, which is the will, we have the bonum, which is the goodness, and with the intellect, which we have the truth, the verum. And the two of them produces the beauty, the pulchrum. And we can also have this consideration by separation of the unum with respect to another, and then we have something. Now let me talk about the unum. The unum. Okay. Well, this is unity. It is the negation of the division of an entity. So the entity, in this sense, is simple because it is indivisible in act and in potency. So that I don't have any potency to be in divide. I cannot code you or myself to have another one. And so the being of any entity consists in its indivision. It is the ens indivisum. This is the Latin expression, ens indivisum. And the truth, well, the entity referred to the intellect is what Thomas Aquinas called adequation re et intellectus. So we say there is truth in the intellect when we affirm being what it is and when we deny being what it's not. So the truth declares and manifests the being of the entity, and the being causes the truth of the intelligence because it is firstly in the things. So the ontic truth implies a real identifications with the self-entity. Besides, it also adds the adequation with the intellect. That is the verum. Now, as the truth is grounded in the entities, and
so you know you got like 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay. As the truth is grounded in the entity, and this one is by the art being, we can conclude that the truth is in ultimate instance founded in the being by participation. Therefore, every entity is true because the first and unique truth by which everything else is conforming according to the measure of their own composition of act of being and essence. Now, I'm going to explain this last attribute, that is goodness, and then we can summarize. The entity achieves its ends or goodness by its operations. Remember that operations are produced by the active potency, like knowing, which is the actualization of the passive potency. I mean, the rational nature of the individual substance. And this is the ens perfectum, which simply means the entity perfected by the actualization of its own nature. Now, the created goodness, which is in the entity, needs to be completed by operations to achieve the ends to which is ordered. By contrast, the pure art has nothing pending to actualize. Therefore, this perfect act, in this perfect act, we can identify its being and its performance. So the pure act is perfect in this sense, and the being is also the foundation of the goodness. Now, we are not talking about in a moral good, I'm talking about the ontological goodness, the purpose, the reason, the means. Now, to summarize the last, or to synthesize this difference idea, extended causality and proper proportional analogy, we have degrees in the participation of the being and degrees on the unity, goodness, truth, well, and beauty that I didn't explain. Now, that pointed out that the being is eliminated because the being is not limited, so it overflows the essence. It doesn't have restrictions. It's absolute. The being has no pending potency to actualize. Everything is already in actions. It's ens perfectum. And simple, because the being has no composition of matter, form, essence, and substance, and accidents. And yes, so in that way, the being is the foundation, the ontological foundation of reality. Now, if the God of the Bible really exists, or is true, so sorry, this is important. If the God of the Bible is true, it should be this one, this God. Okay, it should be consistent with this, and this it also should be consistent with the God of the Bible. And I'm going to explain this very briefly, just 2 minutes. As the pure act of being is perfect, it's a perfect act. It has its own being. It's the fullness of being. Its being. It can actualize a less important potency. For example, a human form. So it can actualize a human form like Jesus Christ, for example, and it subsists the form, the essence of form, it subsists not with another act of being, having itself an act of being, rather in the act, in the perfect act of the being, of this being. So it can actualize that human form. So this is the incarnation. So it is really full God because it's the pure act of being, the reason that causes the form and or the actualization of the form. And the form is pure humanity. It's human, so, because it's potency in that way. So here we have philosophical metaphysical consistency with biblical or biblical narrative. So I would say that if the God of the Bible is true, it should be compatible with this metaphysical approach. And yes, that is. I don't know if you, Ruxandra, want to explain something or add something.
No, I think it would be a good idea, the conclusion in regards to the biblical God and the nature of Christ, the double nature of Christ as God and human at the same time. I think it'd be good to summarize it, write it down, and put it in the group, and it might be subject to later debates, because I think it's this is like, we don't expect anybody to soak in everything and already understand metaphysics. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to assume this terminology because metaphysics itself, I think it's very logical. And if you don't understand it, if you can't really explain it, you at least understand it with your intuition. So it really resonates with something that we all intuitively believe it's how it should be in terms of reason, argumentation, and interpreting the reality.
Yeah, and that is why God doesn't exist. Rather, it goes beyond, it transcends the existence, because existence implies being shown out of the causes, and God is not metaphysical cause.
Yeah, so existence is the result, is the effect of the cause, and God is not caused. He's the uncaused cause, so therefore he doesn't exist.
So the debate, if somebody wants to debate that, it's not about if God exists or not, is there is a being or there is no being. If there is no being, what can be the ontological foundation of reality? That is the point of this presentation. I hope you enjoy it. Correct.
Whoa.
Thank you.
And Jim is here in essence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's clapping.
Can you scroll down so you can see the bibliography?
Well, obviously,
Sure.
the ontological arguments is one of the things that. What? It's all in Spanish? Hey, look, Thomas Aquinas.
Sorry.
A something simple, actually, and something. Possibly.
We could Google translate those.
I think the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if you know that Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is a really great resource for me, at least. You can find everything very well synthesized with bibliography. I think it's plato.stanford.edu, EDU.
Can one of you guys send me this slideshow or post it to the group? Because we'll have the recording, but at least, the slideshow you can flip
I think it's
through.
important. If David agrees, I think it's yeah, it's definitely necessary and helpful.
Okay,
All right.
so we can grill you next week on all of this?
Sure.
Cool.
I didn't, o sea, no pude entenderlo, Ruxandra. ¿Qué dijo?
If we can upload the presentation on the group, put it, the presentation, the PDF, put it in the
PowerPoint.
group, in the torn, on Facebook.
Sí, yes.
Yeah, either email it to me or just post it on
Mhm.
Facebook to the group.
Yeah, well, should
Yes.
be able to see it all too on the recording. Hopefully.
Try to add me on Facebook as well.
Yeah,
Okay,
you're not there.
we'll hunt you down.
All right. Any other pressing questions before I end?
Not today, but I
No, I
hope,
don't want to ask any.
yeah, I hope you guys will both be there next week, Ruxandra and David, so we
Yeah.
can ask you questions next week.
For sure.
Okay.
What?
Okay.
Yeah, I need to bring a notebook next
Yeah.
time.